The British novelist L.P. Hartley, in his book, said, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." It's very difficult for us to recapture a sense of the world, of ourself, of knowledge, of God that was prevalent in a previous age. As Charles Taylor recently wrote, "It's almost impossible for us to recover today what it felt like to live in a really enchanted world." I'm reminded of an observation that Alistair MacIntyre made at the beginning of the early editions of his book, After Virtue. He mentions Walter Miller's science fiction classic, A Canticle for Leibowitz, in which monks who are living in a post-apocalyptic world centuries after a nuclear war are trying to preserve whatever tattered fragments still remain of the written legacy of a long disappeared civilization, ours, without having any real comprehension of what they were preserving or copying or studying. A grocery shopping list is treated like a sacred text. One of the monks spends his life meticulously copying an old blueprint, slowly coloring in the vast expanses of blue, while leaving the delicate traces of white lines, without realizing that the white on blue is accidental to the real content of the document, that it's only white lines on a blue background because that was an easy and inexpensive way of reproducing the image. So too with us, as we try to understand how the world used to be and how it came to be as it is. We have fragments of the past, but we don't know what they mean. I'm not suggesting that we return to a pre-modern mindset. Even if that were desirable, it would not be possible. There's no going back. I don't have a clear vision of where we're going or how to get there. But I also know that we can't go back whence we came. We can't go home again. The toothpaste is out of the tube. We can't undo the philosophical attitudes that undergird modernity. But we can try to get some appreciation of just what has changed, so we can understand that so much of what we moderns assume about the world, about ourselves, about God, about nature, about knowledge, is not necessarily so, but is historically contingent. But tonight we'll start with a quick review of those three contested philosophical questions of the 13th and 14th centuries, the University of Being, Nominalism, and Voluntarism. We'll bear in mind the insecurity and uncertainty that these changes wrought in our collective psyches. Then we'll see how voluntarism led to the rise of empirical science, how voluntarism led to the removal of moral reasoning from our knowledge of the world, leaving morality to be merely one subjective personal preference, how it led to a delegitimization of any knowledge that's not scientific empiricism, how the manipulation and domination of the world rendered possible by the new science tried to offer a replacement for our lost sense of security, of belonging, of context, how our changed ideas of what knowledge is led to a new way of interpreting the sacred scriptures. So I think I just changed a slide, did I?
Yes.
Okay, wow, it works. Okay. Those three innovations from around 1300, that when we talk about the God's existence, we're using the word being in the same way as when we talk about the chair's existence. Nominalism is the idea that universal properties have no real existence. They're only names that we give for similarities that we perceive. So the world is full of unrelated individual entities. And voluntarism, the idea that God's intellect is subject to God's will. God has no nature that dictates his actions, but it's determined only by his arbitrary will. So this week, we'll be looking at the limits of knowledge and the rise of science as the only valid knowledge. Our collective search for security by limiting our knowledge to what can be proven, what can be reliable scientific knowledge, enabling our control and manipulation of the world. The other side of this sword is the rise of a literalistic reading of sacred scripture. And another consequence is morality becomes merely a private opinion. So since God could do whatever he willed, and this will was unfathomable, God's will and thus the world became absolutely contingent. Since God's will was absolutely alien and contingent, and thus God's reasons for creating the world and the way the world functioned in itself, reality too was perceived as contingent and alienated from the human mind and its existential concerns. Alienation from the meaning of the world and from God leads us to the need to reestablish security, order, and regularity through mastery, manipulation, and self-assertion. Alienated from transcendence, we seek security by scientifically dominating the immanent world, the world we can touch. Blumenberg again, deprived by God's hiddenness of metaphysical guarantees for the world, man constructs for himself a counter world of elementary rationality and manipulability. That's one of Blumenberg's recurrent themes, that the holes left when the old metaphysics had been discarded needed to be filled up by some version that's reconstructed in modernity. Seeing the world as no longer possessed of an accessible order, effort gets redirected to what is accessible, the individual things. We turn our attention to the study of things in the world. Knowledge must now be seen to be certain, reliable for the manipulation of the world. With real knowledge restricted to what can be known with certainty through science, all other knowledge is rendered mere opinion. It's subjective. This was Charles Taylor in an interview the other day in Commonweal. We come to a breaking point in human history with the advent of modern natural science. A common understanding of natural science is that it gives the real nature of things. This invalidates all earlier understandings of the world, which we can no longer make sense of on their own terms. The knowledge gained in this way had a solidity and a certainty, not to speak of technological utility, that the earlier versions of order could not match. And this is one of the hallmarks of modernity, the sense that we're in a new age. This is an age where our metaphysics, our knowledge are more valid, more real than all of the superstitions that came before. And this is a critical element of the modernity's understanding of itself, that we're above and beyond the way things used to be. So under voluntarism now, we see the idea is that everything is radically contingent. Nothing is reliable, nothing is predictable, everything is dependent only upon God's will. So we don't know what the world is. We don't have a map. We don't have a program for it. So the only way to discover is to go out and look at the things themselves. So this gives rise to empiricism, the actual study of the world. We see this in early science. To us, it seems it's taken for granted that science is the study of things in the world, but this was a real change at the time. This idea goes back to, well, it came to popular consciousness in 1934 with an article by M.B. Foster, who was a British analytic philosopher, writing, "The voluntary activity of the creator terminates in the contingent being of the creature. Okay, so it means the things that are contingent. They're subject to nothing but God's will. But the contingent is knowable only by sense experience. If, therefore, the contingent is essential to nature, experience must be indispensable to the science of nature. So here he's pointing out that this idea of voluntarism, that everything is dependent only upon God's will, gives rise to the idea that the only way we can know the world is through our sense experience, through the science of nature, through empiricism. So under this extension of voluntarism, because God might have instituted any natural order that he preferred, nature must be directly examined in order to discern what specific laws God promulgated. Peter Harrison summarized this, saying, "From the concern to preserve the freedom of the deity follows the claim that none of his creative acts is necessitated. From the unconstrained activity of the deity follows the contingency of the natural order. Things don't have to be the way they are. God could have created them any way God wanted. From the contingency of the natural order follows the requirement that nature be investigated empirically." Another rephrasing of it. So our ethics also becomes contingent. Voluntarism is the belief that elevates God's will over God's intellect. God's will is now supreme. Previously, it had been thought that God said that something was right or wrong because it is right or wrong in itself. The ought is built into the is. There's a telos, an order, a final cause, a rationality built into existence. And voluntarism turns that on its head and says now, well, something is right or wrong because God says that it's right or wrong. There is no right or wrong in and of itself. So law is now an act of God's will, not of God's intellect. The moral law cannot now be discerned by our intellects, but only by the law, only by the revelation of the law. So our sense of order, of ordered purpose, of final cause, of teleology in the world is lost. So ethics now has lost its mooring. There's no more moral reasoning per se. It just depends upon what law has been given by the lawgiver. The nominalist implication of divine omnipotence, the radical freedom and alterity of God over against his creation, evacuated natural knowledge of any ethical and moral component. You see examples of this when the moral law becomes a series of extrinsic precepts that we just have to observe. In fact, in Kant's duty ethics, they are praiseworthy only to the extent that we are inclined not to observe them. So the moral precepts are no longer seen as fulfilling the innate nature of the person, the true nature of the person. They don't provide insight into what it is to be a good human being and how best to realize that nature. So we saw this kind of reduction of morality to an extrinsic precept with Bill Clinton's statement, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." That he was applying a very narrow definition of it, a very juridical definition of it. If morality now is subject only to God's will, then God could have rephrased the moral law any way God chooses. So now it's all totally arbitrary. So the nominalist can always imagine that the moral law could always be different from what it is. we're left with the idea that something might bring me pleasure and happiness. Oh, but whoops, it's forbidden by the law. So if I want to do something that's morally abhorrent, but I don't do it because, well, it's against the rules, I still have an attachment. I still have a disordered attachment to that. That's a disordered attachment to sin. This is what the serpent used in Eden when he enticed Adam into believing that God's law is somehow different from our true nature, somehow goes against our true nature, somehow it's arbitrary. You see the rise of something we can call scientism. This came from Wikipedia just this morning, I think. Scientism is the belief that science and the scientific method are the best or only way to render truth about the world and reality. And kudos to the Wikipedia author for pointing out that it is a belief. Because I don't see how this theory that science and the scientific method are the only way to render truth, I don't see how that can account for its own validity. That statement cannot prove itself. It's still a belief system, albeit a prevalent one. Now, if you look at the scientific method, I think we all remember from learning about this in high school, the essence of the scientific method is repeatability. I do an experiment here, I get a certain result, I publish it. Somebody who does it 2 years later on the other side of the earth should be able to do the same experiment and get the same result. And if it's repeatable, then it's seen as being valid. There's a repeatability crisis now in some of the social sciences, but let's just restrict our consideration to the natural sciences, where repeatability is still at the core of the legitimacy of the scientific method. So by its very methodology, we are extracting everything that's not repeatable. We're taking out all history, all ethics, all aesthetics, all biography from our definition of truths now. So it's a very, very limited, narrow version of what the truth is. We've stripped away everything that's not repeatable. You may have encountered the name of William of Ockham in the famous principle of Occam's razor, which says that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity when trying to explain things. So he strips away any kind of final causes, any kind of teleology, any sense of meaning. Scientism, the idea that the only true knowledge is scientific knowledge, imposes an implicit metaphysics on us, including the collapse of a normative order of values. Values now are simply opinions. The totalizing effect of this is that there's no position outside the system from which to make a critique of it. It's everything. Now, one of the consequences of this is we see that we've now defined truth as being fact. Truth is now something that's factual. So if fact is the only kind of truth that there is, now this means that anything that's true must now be factual. And this works its way into the way people learn to read the sacred scriptures. The early church fathers had some very creative interpretations of the scriptures. The contention always was that they should not be restricted simply to the literal sense. And by the literal sense, they meant that which the author intended to write. But now we see the new disciplines of science. The new definition of knowledge is scientific knowledge. The new definition of truth as being fact, being applied, and we see people engaging in a hyper-literalistic reading of the scriptures and trying to explain everything in there as being exemplars of some kind of scientific or historical truth, whereas that had never been the assumption beforehand. So biblical narratives are now interpreted very strictly as conforming to the new scientific definition of truth as being the factual. You see this in the schools today. The Common Core standards talk about the fact-opinion dichotomy. They're teaching children now from kindergarten through the 6th grade with worksheets and so on that there are facts and there are opinions. There's no room left for a truth that might not be factual. It has to be provable. Information that can be proven to be true or false is a fact. Everything else is an opinion. So there's no space left in between for truths that do not meet the strict definition of facticity. Augusto Del Noce wrote about he was a Italian philosopher of the 20th century. His thought was deeply influenced by Nazism and later on communism in Italy. He speaks about the totalizing intolerance of liberalism, that the liberal order cannot tolerate any claim to transcendence because that would place a limit on an individual's autonomy. And it's now seen as being the height of immorality to place any kind of a limit on anybody's autonomy. And he also thought that atheism leads to totalitarianism because there's no transcendent order of truth. There's nothing outside the system to serve as a standard of truth. We see a little bit after 1300, 1500 or so, the rise of Protestantism, which emphasizes the individual's personal relationship with God, which is a good thing. This is a good thing to emphasize. But it does open up space for religious difference now because we may have different interpretations or different experiences of this. So we see the proliferation of Protestant ecclesial communities, each with different interpretations. So the solution is the creation of a secular world where religion is privatized. We see later on the rise of the idea that religion is separate from the rest of culture, and we see this today. Religion is seen as being something private. It's something that you do for an hour on Sunday or maybe Saturday or maybe Friday. It's separate from the rest of culture. One example would be when the British colonizers invaded the Indian subcontinent. They created Hinduism. They thought, well, these people must have some religion. Let's figure out what this religion is and give it a name. Whereas it had never been thought of as being a separate thing called Hinduism until the British said, well, you have to give a name to your religion. So the idea that religion is separate from the rest of culture is very much a modern Western idea. So the divine omnipotence of God is eventually replaced by the omnipotence of the individual. While in late medieval nominalism, the inexhaustible totality of possibility was identified with God, the move of modernity is to identify this totality with the world in relation to which the modern subject asserts itself. Blumenberg frames modernity as an overcoming of transcendence by the immanence of human self-assertion. Modernity reoccupies the sovereignty of God with that of the world. That's Blumenberg's idea of reoccupation. Self-assertion of the individual becomes the de facto value of the age. I get to define who I am, the meaning of the universe, the meaning of reality. I recall that quotation from Justice Kennedy that we looked at for the first 2 weeks. It's all up to me, whatever I decide. So the basis of authority is now the individual and the individual's subjective experience. Basis of authority is no longer found in anything transcendent, anything universal, such as God's nature, God's intellect, the nature of reality. Education used to be dedicated to conforming our will and our intellect to reality. Learning what reality is, learning what the human person is, and adapting our will to that. It's now the other way around. We see the need to remake the world in our own image, whatever we might choose it to be. And looking around, I don't think that's working out very well for us. The assumption today is that we have to redefine our natures any way we choose. And I see that as being profoundly disrespectful of reality, of nature. And I see it as being part of the destruction of the natural world that we see going on around us. Now, there are challenges to this kind of naive scientific view of reality, and we saw some of these developments popping up in the last century. There was a theorem, I guess it came out in the late 30s or so in several different stages, 34 and 38, I believe, by a Austrian mathematician and logician, Kurt Gödel, his incompleteness theorem, in which it was a very, very clever proof. And he showed that no logical system that is at least as complicated as arithmetic can be both consistent and complete. So by consistent, we mean that there are no two contradictory truths in it. You can't say A is B and A is not B. Those would be contradictory. So if it's consistent and it doesn't have any contradictions in it, then it can't be complete, meaning there will always be statements the truth of which cannot be defined. You don't know if they're true or not. So this really cast threw some cold water on the idea that our knowledge could be defined as a logical, complete, consistent, provable series of propositional truths. And then I don't want to make too much of some of the discoveries of quantum mechanics because they really don't translate into our experience of the world as we experience it. But it does bring up some interesting little curiosities. You